Good morning, and welcome to the Museum of the San Ramon Valley's virtual program series. Today is the third presentation in the series. My name is Dan Dunham, the director of the museum. In June, Steve Miniere presented a presentation for us on Highway 21, leading through the valley and into the construction of Highway 680. The museum's virtual gala was held in July, and today we mark the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment of the Constitution, extending the right to vote to roughly half the nation's population. Women being able to exercise their voting rights is particularly important in this election year of 2020. Our presenter today is our own Beverly Lane. Beverly has been a teacher and Oakland Museum docent, former mayor of Danville, elected director of the East Bay Regional Park District, and curator of the Museum of the San Ramon Valley. She has authored numerous articles and 3 books on Valley history. Beverly has also been the driving force on the museum's current exhibit, Women Win the Right to Vote in California and the Country. She will today take us through the history of the suffrage movement and also through the museum's exhibit. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send the questions in anytime during the presentation, and we will address them at the end. And now to our presentation. It is my great pleasure to introduce Beverly Lane. Beverly?
Hello and good afternoon. I am really happy to be able to provide this program on women's suffrage. This is a special week for the centennial. Since last Tuesday, we celebrated the last state ratifying the 19th Amendment. And on the 26th, we will celebrate the amendment being certified and to become part of the US Constitution. So I'm going to begin here with women suffrage warriors, and we are going to talk about some of these women who were extraordinary as they led what was the largest reform movement in the country. So why did they feel like they needed to do this? Let's look at the next slide. In the 19th century, women who were very involved in abolition came to see that there were also inequities for women. And so the suffrage movement grew out of a civil rights movement for women. In the 19th century, here are some of the challenges that women faced. And probably the main one for married women was, as one judge said, that when a man and a wife marry, they become one person, and the man is that person. So women throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century tried to address the rights which were lost when they married. So let's look at the next slide. We count the beginning of this women's rights movement from the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. And you can see there at the top, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote a declaration of sentiments and put 12 resolutions together for this small convention to pursue. She rewrote the Declaration of Independence to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And then in the resolutions, the men and women there were all in agreement on 11 of them, but the 12th talked about women getting the right to vote. And in 1898, that was a very radical idea, but one which Stanton felt was essential in getting women's rights. Next. A woman who was Stanton's mentor was Lucretia Mott. And I wanted to show her because she was one of these indomitable Quaker women who was an abolitionist, a minister in the Quaker Church, and who was willing to stand up and speak in public, which was quite a challenge in that time. Next. And here we see Elizabeth Cady Stanton with one of her 7 children. She may look really sweet here, but this woman was a warrior. Next. She and Susan B. Anthony became a pair of warriors in the 19th century, and they're often the names that you hear most often. Susan B. Anthony was active as a teacher, as an abolitionist, and then became active in women's rights and women's suffrage with the support of her very good friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Next. Anthony went all over the country lecturing, and she was viewed as a leader by everyone. Here is a cartoon of showing Susan B. Anthony irate that she was not allowed to vote in 1872. Next. And I want to mention the Black women involved in this whole effort. This is a picture of Sojourner Truth, who I'm really showing to symbolize the power of the Black women, both as abolitionists and as women supporting women's suffrage. She was one of many. And because of racial attitudes throughout the country, in many ways, what the Black women leaders did, both in abolition and in women's rights and suffrage, was pursue a parallel route. They were once in a while welcomed in the all-white Women's Suffrage Association, and we need to pay tribute to them. I think particularly of a woman called Mary Church Terrell, who helped organize a number of women's organizations and became very politically astute as she worked toward women's suffrage. And with these organizations addressed the particular challenges of African American women in our country. Yes? So I couldn't resist. Here's another Susan B. Anthony picture. She's put in a Greek format here, letting people know that women need their rights to vote. And here's a picture of Elizabeth and Susan together. Elizabeth kept having these children, and Aunt Susan would come and stir the porridge and discipline the children and ask Elizabeth to write for her. And what Elizabeth said in later years was, "I forged the thunderbolts and she fired them." They were an indomitable pair. They lived into the early 20th century, but were not here for the final victory of women's suffrage. Next. So we can look a little bit at California here too, because of course California women won the vote in 1911. And this is an example of a very early, all women organized, all women supported suffrage parade, which took place in 1908 in Oakland. What these women were doing was marching on the Republican convention, state convention, and asking for a plank in their platform which would support women's suffrage. Next. At that point, women were beginning to be better educated, and they began to look outside the home at what could be improved in their society. Some called it the municipal house cleaning. In 1911, for California, here is a wonderful poster that was designed and placed in windows throughout San Francisco. You can see the Golden Gate in the background. And this woman has a Latina Indian look to her. Many people use this graphic to symbolize votes for women, although it was designed for California. And California had special challenges because of the size of the state and because of the strength of the liquor interests, particularly in the hospitality center of the West, which was San Francisco. But women campaigned heavily. Next. And this is a poster that points out that California was not the first Western state to bring women the vote. Next. This is one of the ways that women campaigned, which I thought was quite an interesting one. Since automobiles were a new technology at the time, they purchased a beautiful touring car they called the Blue Liner, and they practiced making speeches. And what they would do is drive the car to where men were or could be drawn, and the men would come to see this extraordinary car. And while they were there, the woman would talk to them about the advantages in giving women the vote in the California election in October of 1911. Next. And of course, we have to talk about local leaders as well. And this is Lillian Close, who with her husband owned a large portion of downtown Danville from Front Street up Diablo, including Harts, and who was very active in the community in helping to start the first library. She was president of the Danville Improvement Club, and she became president of the Danville Equal Suffrage Club in 1911. Okay. And indeed, California succeeded. We became the 6th Western state for women to win the vote. And it was a very narrow election, but it was a successful one. Next. And as you can see from this map, this is a little more into the future. It's 1915. Western states were not as hidebound or traditional as the Eastern states. And there are many theories on why Western men felt it was important for women to win suffrage. And, but it was clear that these were was the first part of the country that gave women the right to vote. And so this is one of these famous cartoons. It was done by Henry Meyer in Puck magazine, and it shows the symbol of America, Columbia, walking east with the idea that women could vote. And the rest of the country has women and men reaching toward Columbia, indicating they indeed desire to have the vote. Okay. Of course, it wasn't unanimous. You know, this is the United States and we have freedom of speech. And the idea that women would have increasing rights, including the right to vote, was a controversial one. So there were anti-organizations. This is an example of one of the postcards that we have at the museum. And they're symbolizing here the idea that if women got more active in the public sphere, that it would end the relationship between men and women at home. And many men were unwilling to give up on that relationship. Next. So there were large organizations opposed to women's suffrage, and women were also active in this organization, in this effort, because many of them felt that women's correct sphere was the home, and that the moral opinions and the moral standards that are provided for the country by the women out of the home would be sullied if they left that atmosphere and got more involved in the public scene. Next. So here we have 3 generations of suffragists: Lucretia Mott on the right, Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the left, and Carrie Chapman Catt in the middle. Next. So let's say a little bit about Carrie Chapman Catt. She was a very determined woman from an early age. And by the time we got to 1915 and we're pursuing the 19th Amendment, she had been an orator throughout the country, an organizer of efforts to win women's suffrage state by state. And she had reached the point now in her 50s that she felt it would be essential that an amendment for women's suffrage be added to the US Constitution. In this picture, she is president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And in some ways, that association had gotten a lot more conservative over 50 or 60 years. But she was not that conservative herself. She was an organizer, her ideas were radical, and she was here to see change. Next. And here we see her at the head of a suffrage parade, and this is in New York. There was a referendum in 1915, which New York men turned down decisively. But when Catt became involved in the next referendum, and she felt New York was very important in this, they had a vote. This is a parade in 1917, and they had a vote in 1917, and New York finally joined the list of states in which women had the right to vote. Next. Now, Catt was one of the 2 leaders who saw this to conclusion, and this other leader was our young Quaker, Alice Paul. And here's Alice, very bright, very well educated. She spent some time in Britain, and she became part of the suffrage movement in Britain while she was there. And she learned a great deal from it. She came back from Britain and was ready to pursue the amendment to the Constitution. She didn't feel like the state by state approach would work, and she was very clear that that her group, which eventually became the National Women's Party, needed to pursue the president and the Congress to get this amendment through. Next. So one of the first things that Alice Paul did was she organized the Parade of Parades, which was one which drew thousands of women from throughout the country to Washington, D.C. the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And this is the cover for that program. She wanted everything to be beautiful. She wanted it dignified. And when you see films about the suffrage movement that are currently being shown, you can see how fabulous this parade was and what a success it was, even though a number of drunken men threatened part of the parade. Next. And here we have President Wilson. Carrie Catt and Alice Paul pursued Wilson. They needed to have him change his mind to make it possible to have women's suffrage. And he was a Southern man. He didn't support suffrage. He thought women's place was exclusively in the home. And when he was elected and came to Washington, D.C., which is a Southern city, he brought a lot of his Southern racist opinions as well. many of which are being discussed in this time of Black Lives Matter. But they both pursued him. Kat, by lobbying and using rational arguments and trying not to be unthreatening, and Paul by doing some very militant activities. Next. You can see here a group of women out in the streets with huge signs saying to Wilson that he needed to support women's suffrage. But that wasn't all that Paul organized. Next. Paul, in January of 1916, and her National Women's Party made the decision to picket the White House. Now, this is the first time that anyone had ever picketed the White House, and she set up her silent sentinels, very dignified group of women with beautiful signs so that Wilson would see them when he went into the White House and when he came out of the White House. The timing was not the best because they began to go out there in January. It was quite cold, but more importantly, in April of that year, America joined the war in Europe. We declared that we would do that. And you know what happens with a war? In a war, you're expected to be loyal. You're not expected to criticize your president. And Carrie Chapman Catt said, we will pursue this amendment, but we will also support the war effort. And so she freed the women in her suffrage association to be active in the war effort, and they were. Alice Paul, ever the single-minded person, said, well, this is a time when Wilson is calling for democracy, and we need democracy at home. And she continued to send her silent sentinels, and then they came with signs which were critical of Wilson in the war. And what happened was groups gathered in front of them and tore down their signs. Police turned away, and ultimately, next slide, later that year, they started throwing the women suffrage representatives in jail. They didn't recognize them as the political prisoners. They threw them in jail with every other woman who would be put in jail, with common criminals. And while they put them in temporarily at first, 4 days, a week, eventually things got very hot and they put them in jail for a much longer time. And the women ended up being mistreated in jail, doing hunger strikes, being force-fed, and it became a symbol of half of the people in the country wanting to vote during the war. Next. So this is what the United States looked like in the period before suffrage was won. And you can see the all blue means women could vote in every election. Others, women could vote for school boards. But the red and orange states, they either had no or little vote. But you see right there in the middle toward the east is a striped state, the state of Tennessee. So what happened is finally Wilson said he supported suffrage. It went to the Congress. Wilson was active there in support. And it passed 2/3 of both the House and the Senate. So the amendment then had to go to the states for ratification. And at that point, there were 48 states, and 36 states need to support the Susan B. Anthony amendment. California's governor called a special session, and on November 1st, 1919, the California legislature, less 2 people, ratified the 19th Amendment. It went through a number of other states until 35 had passed, ending up with a huge battle in Tennessee, which I'm sure you have read about. And Tennessee became the 36th state to support. So with that ratification, this amendment went into the Constitution. Next. And here again, we have our Columbia figure congratulating a young woman and presenting her with a ballot, so that in the election of 1920, women were able to vote. What this did was it enfranchised half of the country, that is about 26 million people, who could now vote. There's a reason for us celebrating this centennial, because that was the largest enfranchisement of people in the entire country. So with this, I'm going to take you on a little tour of the exhibit, which is currently at the museum. We're just going to walk through the tour very quickly. And right now, the museum is not open. It's an indoor museum and is not open, but we are hopeful that it will open in a few weeks or maybe next month. So here we show a suffrage quilt that was made for the California Centennial by Cindy Ryder for the museum. And you can see it's in blues and golds, which is California's color. And we're showing the Votes for Women poster, which you saw in the PowerPoint, a very powerful image for Californians. This part of the exhibit shows the introductory panel in which we talk about the effort for women's rights and suffrage being the largest reform movement in the country. A very significant period, which from many of our vantage points is not all that well covered in California history. We have an authentic 1910 white dress with her sash, and our 1915 caricature, The Awakening, that shows this effort went from the west to the east. The other thing that we have is one of those original stamps. It was a little 3-cent stamp commemorating the centennial of the 1848 Seneca Falls. And I think this weekend, a new suffrage stamp costing, I think, 55 cents is coming out commemorating the suffrage. So here we do show 4 women who were local, who were active suffragists. 3 of them were ranchers, and one, Lillian Close, who we talked about earlier, was a downtown merchant. Our Valley suffragists were just part of that, those California strong women who worked side by side with their husbands to have the economy work at the same time as working on many other things. And this is a replication of that California Equal Suffrage Association banner that women used in 1908, made by Kathy Fitzpatrick, who's been a volunteer for us for many years at the museum. We have Votes for Women dishes too. You need to purchase those at the Belmont House in Washington, D.C. And several other posters. Some things that are particularly wonderful to look at up close are these suffrage postcards. Lauren Thor is a collector of these postcards and other suffrage things, and she lent the postcards to us. There was a whole series of little boys and girls. And the girl is saying, no, I can't marry you till you give me the vote. They're wonderful postcards. And then we are showing an original 1911 San Francisco Call, which was the only San Francisco newspaper to correctly indicate that women won the vote in California. It's very narrow. And so the other newspapers came out saying that vote had been defeated. It's an interesting newspaper. And then we have two of our beautiful portraits of pioneers here in the Valley, and both of these show the McPherson family. There's a whole family on the right and the McPherson women on the left. And Nina McPherson was very active. She was on the equal suffrage. She was vice president of that and active with the Grange. And then this flag. So now we get back to 1920. Because one of the things that Alice Paul did when ratification was being discussed throughout the country was she got this banner, and every time a state passed ratification, she sewed a star on it. And there are lots of pictures of her finishing the state with Tennessee as number 36 and flinging it over the balcony of the National Women's Party balcony to women's applause. So this is our exhibit at the museum, and it concludes our program, except for questions and some answers. So if you have any questions, I'll try and field them. Suffrage is on people's news and on people's lips in this week. And I'm so glad we were able to share this story of California and the country's suffrage experience. So Dan is going to field questions, and what do you have?
Okay, some questions and some comments. Let's do the comments first.
Okay.
There were two. Isabel recommends a film, Iron-Jawed Angels. It's a 2004 film, and it's about the suffrage movement. And then I think a nice comment from Charlene. She says, about your presentation, Beverly, don't hurry, slow down. We wish we were there. And Charlene, I can say the same thing. We wish we were open so you could be here. Yeah. But then as questions, you mentioned the Grange in there. And I remember walking past the picture downstairs, and that we had a female worthy master of the Grange. So first of all, can you describe what the Grange is for everybody? And then was it unusual to have a female worthy master?
Well, the Grange was a really important farming fraternity in the country. It began after the Civil War, and it spread across the country. And in California, Danville's Grange was number 85. And one thing that happened with this fraternity was both men and women could be members. And it was very important in the Valley, with members from every part of the Valley. The Grange Hall was in Danville. And we had two of our women who were officers for the Equal Women's Suffrage Committee, who were or were going to be worthy masters. And the worthy master in the parlance of the Grange was the president of the Grange. And there were some women, but not a whole lot of women. But these particular ones were outstanding. And Libby Wood, who was one of them, was also an officer for many years at the Grange.
Okay, and then Eric had a question about the Puck cartoon. And you may need to look at it. I didn't recognize this, but apparently he did. In the picture of the Puck cartoon, Columbia striding across the country, west to east, the woman in Arizona, the woman with the Arizona sash seems to be pushed to the back. Is that because Arizona was not yet a state, but still wanted to be represented?
Well, you're not talking about the cartoon, you're talking about those six women with in their white, with their shields. And I think probably there wasn't room for all of them to line up inside the photograph.
Okay, because yeah, Eric had mentioned that it was a photograph, so my apology for that one.
Yeah, but I
Uh,
love that photograph, the white dresses of the time and the sash around the head. And, you know, these women were very determined to look feminine as they advocated for the right to vote.
okay, and then Turner asks about the flag and the sash. Is there a meaning with the colors, purple and gold, and is there a history behind the sash that you're wearing?
Let's see. Well, in that period, in the early 20th century, when people used different colors in politics, they always had a reason for it. And the British had a sash which used purple, and for them that was symbolized royalty. But in the United States, it was Alice Paul who set up this banner with gold, white, and purple. And what the colors that they symbolized were purple, which was loyalty and constancy, and white, which, as you might imagine, would be purity and singleness of purpose. And then gold, they talked about gold being life and light. And so you saw that Columbia figure in yellow with her torch. Some people say that the yellow was chosen because they used it first as a suffrage color in Kansas, and the state flower for Kansas was sunflower. But I think the loyalty, purity, and light are the three ways this sash was described by Alice Paul and the Women's Party. And so what I have is a reproduction of the Women's Party one, which is purple, gold, and white. And I actually saw it on someone else, and it looked so lovely. I sent for it, and it did not come from Amazon. It came from some happy hands at home in London. So I'm wearing it this week. So and it's been on a mannequin in a couple of different places. And there will be some things this weekend in which I'll end up wearing white, but I don't have one of those hats.
Okay, Vivian wants to know a little bit more about Columbia, the woman in the posters wearing the Greek robe and supporting the suffrage movement. Did you say she is a symbol of America?
Well, gradually, over the years, people did drawings, and they like to have women representing the best in people's nature. And because somewhat related to Columbus, I think, they ended up with a woman whom they called Columbia. And she appears in many locations, there many drawings, and often you will see them in drawings coming the other direction, with Eastern ideas coming to the West. There's one very famous portrait of that. And I would say the Statue of Liberty is probably a version of Columbia.
Okay, and then Eric has a question about the difference between a state and a territory's ratification. Did territories ratifying the women's vote carry the same weight as a state?
Well, interesting. You know, of course, if they weren't a state, they couldn't vote for president. But a number of territories gave women the vote early on. Wyoming and Utah are two of them. And then when they came to join as a state, there was some controversy over keeping the women's suffrage or not. In Wyoming, they stood up and said, well, that's just part of us becoming a state, and you have to accept that. In Utah, there were issues of polygamy and all kinds of opinions about Mormons. And for a period of time, women had the vote as a territory, but not in the state. But that was not too long, and Utah women had the vote early on.
Okay, and then again, a comment. Thank you to Turner for this. Great presentation. Thank you so much. Amazing to learn. And again, another thank you. And I think we can all concur with that one, Turner. So that's it for questions, Beverly. Thank you very much. I have some announcements to make, and then we'll wrap today up. First of all, I'd like to thank Tori Taylor for the video that you saw. Beverly mentioned the weekend, and on Sunday, our friend Marcia Harmon, museum friend Marcia Harmon, will be hosting an open house at her new store location of Cottage Jewel, 391 Harts Avenue in Danville from 10:30 to 1. And the reason that I'm kind of mentioning it now is that it will feature the museum and our suffrage exhibit. And you may see some suffrage marchers there. I get the impression that Beverly with sash will be on duty that day. Our next program will be on Thursday, September 24th at 11:30. Museum docents Vivian Wong and Renee Spitz will present a program about the first peoples of California, how they lived and where they are today. If you like these programs and want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's homepage and clicking on the Donate Now button. Thank you all for viewing today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Stay safe and remember the ladies.